It came down to one order, one commander who chose differently. This is what happens next. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most dangerous places on the planet. It is a narrow strip of water that connects the Persian Gulf to the rest of the world. At its tightest point, the shipping lane is only 2 miles wide. If you want to get oil out of the Middle East, you have to pass through this needle, and sitting right on the edge of that needle is Iran. For years, the United States Navy has moved through these waters like they owned them. And, in a way, they did. They have the most advanced ships ever built. The crown jewel of that power is the aircraft carrier. It is a massive steel mountain. It is over 1,000 feet long. It weighs 100,000 tons. When a carrier shows up, the world stops and looks. It is a floating city designed to fight entire countries. It is built to survive nuclear blasts. But it was never really designed for what was about to happen. The Iranian Navy knew they could never build a ship that could go one-on-one with an American carrier. If they tried, they would be sunk in minutes. So they did something different. They went small. They spent years buying and building thousands of fast attack craft. To a normal sailor, these look like pleasure boats or fishing vessels. But these boats are made of fiberglass and carbon fiber. They are very hard to see on a radar screen because they sit so low in the water, and they are fast. Some can go 60 miles per hour. Each boat carries a punch. Some have a couple of heavy machine guns. Some have a launcher for a single cruise missile. Others are just filled with high explosives and a driver who is willing to die. They do not need to sink the carrier with one hit. They just need to overwhelm it. This is the swarm tactic. It is based on a very simple math problem. A carrier group has a limited number of bullets and missiles. If you send 100 targets at them, they might stop all of them. If you send 1,000, they will run out of ammo before you run out of boats. On a Tuesday afternoon in May, the carrier was moving through the strait. The sun was beating down on the flight deck. It was 95 degrees. The sailors were tired. They had been on deployment for 6 months. They were looking forward to getting home. Routine is the biggest enemy in the military. When you do something every day for months, you start to relax. You stop looking at the horizon. You trust the machines to do the work for you. In the Combat Information Center, deep inside the ship, it was dark and air-conditioned. Dozens of sailors sat in front of glowing blue screens. They were watching the world around them through the eyes of the Aegis radar system. This system is the best in the world. It can track hundreds of objects in the air and on the water. For most of the morning, the screens were quiet. A few tankers were moving slowly. A few fishing boats were bobbing in the waves. Nothing unusual. Then, at exactly 2 in the afternoon, the screen flickered. A group of fast-moving contacts appeared near the Iranian coast. They were moving at 40 knots. That is fast for a boat. At first, it looked like a drill. The Iranians do this all the time. They like to buzz the American ships to show they are there. It is a game of chicken that has been going on for 40 years. But then more contacts appeared. Then more. They were coming out from behind the islands and the rocky coves along the shore. The radar operators started counting. 10, 20, 50, 100. The dots started to fill the screen. They were not staying together. They were spreading out. They were forming a massive circle around the American fleet. The sailor in charge of the radar looked at his supervisor. He did not say anything. He did not have to. The supervisor saw it too. This was not a drill. This was an ambush. The American commander was a man who had spent 30 years in the Navy. He had seen everything, but he had never seen the screen look like this. The dots were closing the distance. They were only 10 miles away now. In a speedboat, that is less than 15 minutes of travel time. The carrier was in a bad spot. It was in the middle of the narrow shipping lane. It could not speed up or it would hit a tanker. It could not turn because the water was too shallow on the sides. He had to make a decision. If he waited too long, the boats would be close enough to fire their missiles. If they fired all at once, his defenses would be overwhelmed. But if he fired first, he would be the one who started a war. He picked up the radio. He tried to call the boats on the international hailing frequency. He told them they were approaching a United States naval vessel and that they needed to change course immediately. There was no answer, only static. The boats were 5 miles away. He could see them now from the bridge. The horizon was suddenly filled with white foam from thousands of engines. The sound was like a swarm of angry hornets. The commander looked at his watch. He looked at his men. Then he gave the order that changed history. He told his ships to open fire. The first blast from a 5-inch gun shook the entire fleet. The war had begun, and the carrier was about to find out that it was no longer the apex predator of the ocean. The first shot fired from the American fleet was a warning. It was a 5-inch shell. It hit the water hundreds of yards in front of the leading Iranian boats. It sent a massive pillar of white water into the air. In a normal world, that would be enough. Most people stop when a destroyer fires a cannon at them, but these were not normal boats. The Iranian swarm did not slow down. They did not change course. They actually went faster. The American commander realized then that this was not a game of chicken. It was an attack. He gave the order to engage all incoming targets. Within seconds, the quiet of the Persian Gulf was replaced by a sound like 1,000 jackhammers. This was the Phalanx. Sailors call it the Sea Whiz. It is a Gatling gun that fires 6,000 rounds of tungsten bullets every minute. It is designed to create a wall of metal that nothing can pass through. The guns on the destroyers started to scream. They were tracking the closest boats. At 3 miles out, the accuracy was incredible. The first 10 Iranian boats disappeared in clouds of splinters and fire. They were made of fiberglass. They stood no chance against heavy machine guns. But for every boat the Americans sank, 5 more appeared on the radar. The swarm was not one group. It was dozens of groups, coming from every direction at once. This is where the math started to break. The Aegis combat system is a masterpiece of engineering. It can track over 100 targets, it can guide missiles to hit them perfectly, but the system was designed to fight other big ships and high-flying jets. It was designed to hit targets that are easy to see and follow. The Iranian boats were tiny. They were bouncing on the waves. They were zigzagging. Sometimes the radar would lose them in the clutter of the water. The computers inside the carrier started to struggle. There were too many dots. The screen looked like it was covered in digital snow. Then came the missiles. The Iranian boats started launching small, short-range cruise missiles. They were not powerful enough to sink a carrier, but they were enough to confuse the defenses. The American destroyers had to use their own missiles to stop them. Each defensive missile costs millions of dollars. They are big and heavy, and the ships only carry a certain number of them. This is what military experts call magazine depth. It is a fancy way of saying you are running out of bullets. The American fleet was firing everything they had. They were winning the battle. They were sinking boats by the dozen. But the Iranians were not trying to win a fair fight. They were trying to drain the Americans dry. They were using cheap boats to trade for expensive missiles. After 10 minutes of constant firing, one of the destroyers reported that it was low on ammunition. Its main guns were overheating. That was the turning point. The wall of metal started to show gaps. One Iranian boat, filled with hundreds of pounds of explosives, saw a gap in the defensive fire. The driver did not hesitate. He aimed his boat directly at the side of a billion-dollar destroyer. The sailors on the deck of the destroyer saw it coming. They fired their rifles. They hit the boat dozens of times. But the boat kept coming. It hit the hull right at the waterline. The explosion was so loud it could be heard for miles. It tore a hole in the side of the ship the size of a garage door. The destroyer did not sink. American ships are built to survive hits, but it started to tilt to one side. It had to slow down to manage the flooding. When that destroyer slowed down, it could no longer protect the carrier. The shield was broken. The rest of the swarm saw the opening. They ignored the sinking destroyer. They ignored the other ships. They ignored the other ships. They all turned their bows toward the aircraft carrier. The biggest ship in the world was now wide open, and the swarm was only 2 miles away. The commander on the carrier looked out at the water. He saw hundreds of white wakes trailing behind the speedboats. It looked like a field of arrows all pointing at his heart. He knew his ship could take a hit. He knew his crew was the best in the world, but he also knew something else. He realized that in this narrow water, his 100,000-ton ship was not a fortress. It was a cage. The swarm was no longer a group of boats. It was a wall of noise and fire. The aircraft carrier was firing everything it had. The heavy machine guns on the side of the ship were glowing red from the heat. The sailors were reloading as fast as they could. But for every boat they hit, 2 more seemed to take its place. The American fleet had reached the saturation threshold. This is the point where there are simply more targets than there are guns to hit them. It is a nightmare for a commander. It means that no matter how good your technology is, the math is against you. The first hit on the carrier did not come from a boat. It came from above. While the sailors were looking at the water, a dozen small drones had been flying low over the waves. They were made of plastic. They were too small for the big radar to see. One of them flew directly into a parked fighter jet on the flight deck. The explosion was small. It only carried a few pounds of explosives. But that jet was full of fuel. In seconds, the top of the carrier was a lake of fire. The crew could not launch any more planes. The carrier was not sinking, but it was no longer a weapon. In the military, they call this a mission kill. The ship is still floating, but it can no longer do its job. The commander saw the fire spreading across the deck. He heard the reports of more boats closing in. He knew that if he stayed in the narrow water, he would lose the entire ship. He gave the order that no American commander ever wants to give. He told the fleet to turn around and get out of the strait. As the carrier began its slow turn, the swarm saw their chance. They did not go after the carrier anymore. They knew it was out of the fight. Instead, they turned toward the ships following behind. These were the supply ships. They are the lifeblood of the Navy. One of them was the United States naval ship, Alan Shepard. It was carrying thousands of tons of fuel and ammunition. It was not a warship. It only had a few small guns for defense. It was a massive, slow-moving target. The Iranian boats swarmed it like wolves. They hit it from 3 sides at once. The explosions were massive. The Alan Shepard did not stand a chance. By sunset, the pride of the United States Navy was steaming away from the Persian Gulf. Behind them, a pillar of black smoke marked the spot where their supply ship had gone down. The news hit the world like a physical blow. For the first time in 80 years, an American carrier had been forced to retreat. The first week of the war was total chaos. The Iranian government immediately declared the Strait of Hormuz closed. They said that any ship that entered would be destroyed. They did not just mean American ships. They meant everyone. This was the beginning of the Hormuz Premium. It is a term for the extra cost people pay when the world's most important oil route is blocked. In the first 48 hours, the price of a barrel of oil doubled. Then, it tripled. In cities across the world, people started lining up at gas stations. The stock market had its worst day in history. Trillions of dollars disappeared in a single afternoon. The world was realizing that its entire economy was built on the idea that the United States Navy could keep the water open. Now, that idea was dead. The Americans were not giving up. They were gathering a massive force in the Indian Ocean, but they were realizing that they were fighting a new kind of war. It was not a war of big ships and grand battles. It was a war of thousands of small, cheap things against a few big, expensive things. And in the first month, the cheap things were winning. The aircraft carrier was finally out of the narrow water. It was moving toward the open ocean where it had room to maneuver. It was safe from the swarms of speedboats for now, but the commander soon realized he had a new problem. His ship was starving. Most people think about aircraft carriers as massive weapons. They think about the jets and the missiles and the power they project. They forget that a carrier is also a city of 5,000 people. Those people need to eat every day. The jets need thousands of gallons of fuel for every single mission. The ship itself needs parts and maintenance. In the Navy, they have a name for this. They call it logistics. It is the boring part of war that actually decides who wins. You can have the best fighter jet in the world, but if you do not have the fuel to put in the tank, that jet is just a very expensive piece of art sitting on a deck. The Iranian attack had changed the rules of the game. They did not have to sink the carrier to win. They just had to stop its life support. This is what experts call a logistics kill. It is a slow and quiet way to defeat a superpower. The loss of the supply ship, the Alan Shepard, was a disaster. It was carrying enough fuel to keep the entire fleet moving for weeks. It had enough food to feed 30,000 sailors across the whole strike group. When it went down, the clock started ticking. Every ship in the fleet has a certain amount of supplies on board. Usually, they have enough for about 10 or 15 days of heavy fighting. After that, they need to meet a supply ship in the middle of the ocean to reload. It is like a gas station that comes to you. But now, there were no gas stations coming. The other supply ships in the region were terrified. They were large and slow and had almost no weapons. They were built to carry cargo, not to fight. They were watching the news just like everyone else. They saw what happened to the Alan Shepard. They were refusing to enter the water near the Middle East. The carrier group was now sitting in the Indian Ocean. They were hundreds of miles away from the fight. But they were running out of everything. The jets on the deck were mostly grounded. The commander had to save the fuel in case of an emergency. The sailors were told to start rationing food. The air conditioning was turned down to save power. The mood on the ship changed from anger to a deep, heavy anxiety. This is the part of the story most movies skip. They show the big explosions. They do not show the commander looking at a spreadsheet and realizing he only has 3 days of jet fuel left. They do not show the mechanics who cannot fix a broken radar because the spare parts were on a ship at the bottom of the ocean. Back in Washington, the leaders were in a panic. They realized that the United States Navy was built for a specific kind of war. It was built to fight other big navies in the middle of the deep blue sea. It was not built to protect a grocery store ship from 1,000 tiny boats in a narrow channel. They had spent trillions of dollars on the carriers. They had spent almost nothing on making the supply ships fast or tough. It was a massive hole in the armor, and the Iranians had found it. The Americans had a choice. They could try to send more supply ships in with a massive escort of destroyers, but that would take ships away from the actual fight. Or they could try to fly supplies in using giant cargo planes. But you cannot fly enough fuel for a carrier group. It is physically impossible. The numbers do not add up. The world was watching. For decades, the American carrier was the symbol of ultimate power. It was the thing you sent to tell a country to stop what they were doing. Now, that symbol was sitting idle in the ocean because it was out of gas. The Iranian government was using this to their advantage. They were broadcasting images of the empty Strait of Hormuz. They were telling the world that the era of the big ships was over. They called the carriers floating coffins. It was a psychological war as much as a physical one, and the Americans were losing. The fear was spreading to other parts of the world. Other countries were looking at their own navies. They were looking at their own expensive ships. They were wondering if they had made a huge mistake. The commander of the carrier group sat in his cabin. He was looking at the fuel reports. He had enough to stay in the area for 1 more week. After that, he would have to sail all the way back to a friendly port just to get a refill. If he left, the entire region would belong to Iran. The oil would stop flowing. The global economy would collapse. But if he stayed, his ships would eventually become dead weight in the water. He was waiting for an answer from the president. He was waiting for a plan. But there was no easy plan for a problem this simple and this devastating. He realized that the swarm had done more than just damage a ship. It had broken the machine that allowed America to be everywhere at once. The machine was out of parts. And the world was about to see what happens when the superpower has to go home. The carrier group was 500 miles away from the Iranian coast. It was safe from the speedboats, but it was also useless. The aircraft carrier was limping through the water. The massive flight deck was a graveyard of burned metal and twisted jet engines. Without that deck, the carrier is just a very expensive target. The commander had to make a choice that no American leader had made in 80 years. He had to tell 5,000 sailors that they were not going back into the fight. This was the first time a United States carrier group had been forced to retreat since the Second World War. The message this sent to the rest of the world was louder than any explosion. In Washington, the leaders were in a total panic. They were arguing about whether to send a second carrier strike group into the Persian Gulf. But the admirals told them the truth. They said that sending another carrier would just be giving the Iranians another target. They realized they were bringing a giant hammer to a fight against a swarm of flies. The flies were winning because they were too small to hit and too many to count. The military has a term for this situation. They call it anti-access area denial. It is a long way of saying that someone has made a piece of the world too dangerous for you to enter. Iran had used cheap boats and plastic drones to close the most important waterway on Earth. The total cost of the Iranian swarm was about $50 million. The cost of the American fleet was over $15 billion. The math was terrifying for the Pentagon. If a $50 million force can defeat a $15 billion force, the rules of history have changed. Every other country in the world was watching this happen in real time. They saw the most powerful navy in history turning its back and sailing away. The era of the supership was facing a crisis. For 100 years, the biggest ship was the winner. The battleship gave way to the aircraft carrier. But now, size was a weakness. The bigger the ship, the more it had to lose. The American fleet was built for the middle of the deep blue ocean. It was built to track high-flying bombers and large enemy ships from hundreds of miles away. In the open sea, the carrier is a god. But in the narrow water near a coast, the carrier is a prisoner. The radar systems that cost billions of dollars were designed to look up at the sky. They were not designed to look down at a wave and see a fiberglass boat. They were not designed to see a drone that weighs less than a suitcase. The sailors on the carrier were exhausted. They were working 24 hours a day to keep the ship moving. They were eating cold rations because the kitchens were powered down to save fuel. The mood on the ship was dark. They had been told they were the invincible force. Now they were running away from boats they could buy at a local harbor. One of the younger sailors asked his chief a question that no one wanted to answer. He asked if they were ever going back. The chief just looked out at the empty ocean and didn't say a word. The truth was that the Navy didn't know how to go back. They didn't have a weapon that could kill a swarm without using up all their ammo in an hour. They were realizing that they had spent decades building the wrong kind of Navy. They had built a few massive, perfect things. They should have built thousands of small, cheap things. The world was changing right in front of them, and the American superpower was standing still. The aircraft carrier was not at the bottom of the sea, but for the men and women on board, it might as well have been. The fire on the flight deck was mostly out. The sailors had spent 10 hours fighting the flames in the heat. They were covered in soot and white foam. They were exhausted. But the damage was already done. The deck of an aircraft carrier has to be a perfect surface. It must be perfectly flat and perfectly clean. If there is one piece of metal the size of a bolt left on that deck, a jet engine will suck it up. The jet will explode and the pilot will die. The fire from the drone had warped the heavy steel of the deck. The heat was so intense that the metal was no longer flat. It looked like a piece of plastic that had been left in the sun for too long. The specialized coating that lets jets land without slipping was gone. The thick wires that catch the planes when they land were melted into lumps. The carrier was now just 100,000 tons of useless metal. It was still floating. Its engines were still turning. But it could not do the one thing it was built to do. It could not launch a single plane. The commander looked at his fighter jets. They were sitting in the hangar, bay deep inside the ship. They were the most advanced killing machines ever made by humans. Each one cost over $100 million. But they were trapped. They were like birds in a cage with no door. The commander realized his ship was no longer a weapon. It was a liability. It was a giant iron anchor pulling the rest of the fleet down. Every destroyer and cruiser in the group was now focused on only one thing. They were not looking for the enemy anymore. They were not trying to win the war. They were just trying to keep the carrier from being hit again. The fleet had become a group of bodyguards for a giant who could not fight back. This is the hidden cost of the supership. When you put all your power into one big thing, you have a single point of failure. If that one thing breaks, the whole system stops working. The Iranians knew this from the beginning. They were not trying to sink the ship with a single blow. They were just trying to break its tools. And they had done it with a plastic drone and a few gallons of gasoline. The news of the carrier's damage was spreading across the world in real time. People were not just shocked, they were terrified. The American Navy was supposed to be the one thing that never failed. It was the backbone of the entire global system. If the Navy could not protect itself, it could not protect the world. The price of oil was no longer just going up, it was exploding. In some cities, people were fighting in the streets over the last few gallons of gas. The stock markets in New York and London stayed closed for the third day in a row. The global economy was grinding to a halt. It was like the world was suffering from a massive stroke. The blood of the global economy is oil, and the heart that pumps that oil had just stopped beating. Back on the carrier, the sailors were quiet. They were cleaning the deck by hand. They were picking up pieces of charred metal and throwing them into the ocean. But they knew it was a useless task. They were waiting for a supply ship that was never coming. They were waiting for orders that no one in Washington wanted to give. They were realizing that they were part of a history that was ending. The age of the carrier had lasted for nearly 100 years. It had begun in the smoke of a surprise attack a century ago. It was ending on a hot Tuesday afternoon in the Persian Gulf. The world was moving on to something new and dangerous, and the carrier was being left behind in the dark. The news of the carrier's retreat did not just stay in the Middle East. It traveled to every capital on the planet in minutes. Leaders in China, Russia, and Europe were all watching the same video. They saw the giant ship turning away from the fight. They saw the smoke rising from its deck. They saw the tiny Iranian boats dancing on the waves. Every admiral in every navy suddenly had a very difficult conversation with their government. They had spent 40 years telling their leaders that big ships were the answer to every problem. They had asked for billions of dollars to build these massive steel islands. Now, they had to explain why a group of cheap speedboats had just beaten the most powerful ship in history. This was the birth of the Cloud Fleet. The idea had been talked about in military schools for years, but no one really believed it would happen until now. The idea is simple. Instead of building one massive ship that costs $13 billion, you build 1,000 small ships. Each one costs $13 million. The math of the Cloud Fleet is much harder for an enemy to beat. If you lose one ship in a swarm of 1,000, you still have 999 ships left. The enemy cannot win the war by hitting one target. They have to hit every single one. The United States Navy started a crash program to build this new kind of force. They did not have years to design new ships from scratch. They started buying anything they could find that moved fast on the water. They bought commercial racing boats. They bought fishing vessels. They even bought luxury speedboats. They stripped out the seats and the fancy gear. They filled the hulls with computers and remote control systems. They put a single missile launcher or a laser weapon on the deck. They were turning the ocean into a digital battlefield. But they were not just building boats. They were building a new kind of mind. A human commander cannot control 100 boats at once. It is too much information for a human brain to process. You need artificial intelligence to make the swarm work. The Navy began launching thousands of small, autonomous drones into the water. These drones were designed to talk to each other without humans in the loop. They moved together like a school of fish or a flock of birds. If one drone saw a target, every other drone in the area knew about it instantly. They did not wait for a commander back at base to tell them what to do. They decided for themselves how to attack. This was a terrifying shift in the history of warfare. For thousands of years, humans have been the ones making the decisions on the battlefield. Now, the machines were in charge. The Persian Gulf became a testing ground for this new technology. The Iranians still had their speedboats, but now they were meeting an American swarm that was just as fast and just as many. The water was soon filled with thousands of tiny, unmanned vessels. They were fighting each other in a war that no human could see with their own eyes. It was a battle of algorithms. It was a race to see which computer could think and react faster. The sailors on the aircraft carrier were watching this from a distance. They felt like they were watching the end of their own profession. They were warriors who had trained for years to operate a massive, complex machine. Now, they were just watching small, cheap robots do the job for them. The global economy was still in deep trouble. Oil was still hard to find. But the war was changing. The Iranians were finding out that their swarm tactic only worked because the Americans were using the wrong tools. Now that the Americans were using the same tactics, the advantage was gone. But there was a dark side to this new victory. The technology was spreading. Once you show the world that a cheap swarm can beat a carrier, everyone wants a swarm. Terrorist groups started building their own drones. Small countries that could never afford a navy started building their own cloud fleets. The ocean was becoming a place where no one was safe. You did not need $1 billion to be a naval power anymore. You just needed a credit card and some clever software. The world was realizing that they had traded a stable, predictable system for a chaotic one. The era of the supership was over, but the era of the swarm was just beginning, and it was going to be much harder to control. Imagine a harbor 100 years from now. You would see something that would look very strange to a sailor from our time. The horizon is empty. There are no massive gray ships with thousands of men on board. There are no giant holes that block out the sun when they dock. Instead, the water is alive with movement that you can barely see. It is a world of ghosts. The ocean is filled with millions of small, silent machines. Some are the size of a surfboard. Others are the size of a shipping container. They do not have crews. They do not have kitchens or beds or bathrooms. They are just engines and sensors and weapons. The world has moved on from the era of the giant ship. We call this the age of the smart sea. It started on that day in the Persian Gulf when the first carrier turned around. That one moment changed the way every human on Earth thought about power. Before that day, power was about being big. It was about having the most steel and the most money in one place. After that day, power became about being everywhere at once. It became about being too small to find and too cheap to care about losing. By the year 2126, the concept of a global superpower is gone. The United States Navy still exists, but you would not recognize it. It does not sail across the world to start wars or stop them. No one does. It is simply too dangerous to put a big target on the water. A single teenager with a laptop and a few $1,000s can now sink a ship that costs billions. The math of war never went back to the old way. Because of this, the world has become a series of islands. Trade still happens, but it looks different. Goods do not travel on massive tankers that carry millions of barrels of oil. Those ships were too easy to kill. Now, trade moves in swarms. Thousands of small, autonomous cargo boats move together across the ocean. If a pirate or a rogue nation attacks, they might sink 10 or 20 of them, but the other 900 boats keep moving. The loss is just a line on a spreadsheet. It is not a national tragedy. It is not a reason to go to war. The global economy had to learn how to survive without the big ships. When the Strait of Hormuz closed for good, the world suffered for a decade. There were famines and riots. But then, humans did what they always do. They adapted. Countries stopped relying on oil from across the world. They built their own energy systems at home. They grew their own food in vertical farms. The closing of the sea forced the world to grow up. If you go to a museum in this new world, you will see a model of an aircraft carrier. Children look at it the way we look at the pyramids. They cannot believe that 5,000 people used to live on one piece of metal. They think it was a strange and wasteful way to live. They see it as a relic of a time when humans thought they could control nature with brute force. The ocean today belongs to no one. It is a digital wilderness. The sensors on the sea floor know when a whale swims by. They know when a storm is coming 3 days before it hits. But they also know when an enemy tries to move. The moment a large ship enters the water, the swarm wakes up. The intruder is surrounded in minutes. It does not matter how many guns the big ship has. It cannot fight a ghost. The people of this new world are safer in some ways. There are no more world wars between massive fleets, but they are also more alone. The era of the global policeman is over. Every country has to look after itself. The great connection that the carriers provided is gone. The world is smaller now. It is quieter. And it all started with a few fiberglass boats and a change in the math. The carrier was the ultimate symbol of the old world. The swarm is the reality of the new one. The shadow of that afternoon in the Persian Gulf reaches forward for 1,000 years. It marked the end of a very old idea. For most of human history, power was about being big. If you were a king, you built the tallest castle. If you were an empire, you built the largest navy. The logic was simple. The person with the most concentrated power could force everyone else to follow their rules. The aircraft carrier was the peak of that logic. It was 100,000 tons of authority. But when the swarm won, that authority evaporated. The long shadow of this event is a world where power is distributed. It is the democratization of destruction. When anyone can build a weapon that can kill a giant, the giants go away. This changed the very nature of what a country is. In the old world, a government protected its borders with big armies. In the new world, borders do not mean as much. You cannot stop a swarm with a border. You cannot stop a drone with a passport check. Historians of the future look back at our time as the end of the great centralization. They see it as the moment humanity moved from the era of the pyramid to the era of the web. A pyramid has one top and a wide base. If you take out the top, the whole thing falls. A web has no top. You can cut 100 strings, and the web is still there. This made the world much harder to govern. No one can truly lead the whole planet anymore. There is no single seat of power that everyone looks toward, but it also made the world harder to destroy. In the age of carriers, a war between two superpowers could end the world in a week. In the age of the swarm, war is constant but small. It is a background noise of 1,000 tiny conflicts. It is like a fever that never quite goes away but never kills the patient. Humanity had to learn to live with a new kind of instability. We gave up the dream of total security. In exchange, we got a world where no single person can ever be too powerful. The shadow of the swarm is a world where the individual matters more than the machine. It is a world where cleverness is more valuable than steel. The giants are dead, and they are never coming back. Looking back, it is clear that the world changed on that day in the Persian Gulf. The aircraft carrier was once the ultimate symbol of power, but it could not survive a math problem. We learned that 1,000 small things can be much more dangerous than one big thing. This shift has changed the way every nation thinks about defense and safety. It was not just a battle between two countries. It was a battle between two ways of thinking. One side believed in the power of a single giant. The other side believed in the power of the crowd. The crowd won. Here are the lessons we can take from this story. The first lesson is that quantity has a quality of its own. When you do not need to be perfect to win, you only need to be lucky once. The second lesson is that you are only as strong as your weakest link. The aircraft carrier is a masterpiece of technology, but it cannot move or fight without fuel and food. By hitting the slow supply ships, the swarm defeated the giant without ever having to sink it. The third lesson is that big targets are a liability in small spaces. In the middle of the deep blue ocean, a carrier is a king that no one can touch. But in a narrow strait, that size becomes a prison that makes it impossible to hide. The fourth lesson is that the future of power is distributed. We are moving away from a world of massive centers of authority and toward a world that looks like a web. In this new world, being everywhere at once is much better than being the biggest thing in the room. The final lesson is that technology is a trap if you do not change how you use it. The United States spent billions of dollars on the best radar in the world, but that radar was looking for the wrong kind of enemy. Success in the future belongs to whoever can adapt their mind faster than the enemy can change their weapons. The age of the supership is over, but the world is still finding its way in the age of the swarm. This is a hypothetical scenario based on the historical record. Real outcomes would depend on factors no model can predict.